So, last weekend, the Dutch Lions Cup happened out in the Netherlands, and there was a really cool finals match. Now, normally when I am doing finals matches, I want to try to basically gear down each person's tactics and choices and what they did that worked and what they did that didn't work. But today, I want to really focus on the probing strike. Now, you've probably heard me say probing strike before, but in case you don't know, or I never bothered to explain it, a probing strike is a concept where you throw an attack that doesn't necessarily have the intent of landing something or getting a bunch of points, but really its intent is to make your opponent move out of the defensive position that they're already in. And we see a lot of examples of this in this fight. And the basic premise that it comes down to is if you throw an attack that you can recover from faster than your opponent can parry and then recover from in and of itself, you are going to have an opportunity. So we're going to see a lot of great examples of probing attacks being used to set up follow-up strikes and a whole lot of great fencing overall, because also on top of everything, Dutch Lions Cup does a best 2 out of 3 finals, which means we got lots of exchanges to cover and lots of examples to go over. Now, before we get into the probing strike, the first thing we have to do is set up the reason and the conditions for why you would want to use probing strikes to begin with, and that brings us to our first 2 exchanges in the fight. In the first exchange, we have Yannick go in for a nice big thrust and lands it. And frankly, there's just not a lot to talk about here. It's a well-executed thrust. But the next piece of the setup comes in the following exchange, where Yannick goes for that exact same thrust, but finds that his opponent was very able to parry and riposte it with a left zwerk to his underside. And what this leads you to understand is that this big thrust as an opener is not a probing strike. Given the definition that I gave earlier, what makes a probing strike is your ability to recover from it, and a big thrust towards the head is the opposite of easy to recover from. It is highly committed. It requires a lot of forward momentum that you have to stop. It requires your arms to be fully extended, which makes them available targets, and it takes your hands up high, which means that the underside of your arms and your ribs are open for targets as well, which Yannick's opponent immediately seizes upon. So these are the conditions that set up the necessity for the probing strike, which we're now going to take a look at. Now, Yannick has shown in the previous 2 exchanges that he loves his thrusts, and Henrik has proven that he has the ability to parry that thrust and throw a follow-up, and this is the context in which Yannick does his first adaptation, start using the probing strike. And in this exchange, the third exchange, we see Yannick do a probing strike in the form of coming forward, raising up into a high right-sided ox, and threatening with a thrust that he doesn't actually follow through on. And the reason I consider this to be a probing strike is because it takes away a lot of the forward commitment, but maybe not all, that he had in the previous kind of thrust that he was throwing. Once he throws this feinted probing thrust, he immediately tries to lower his hands to parry the follow-up left zwerk that he knows is coming, and isn't quite able to make it there in time. But you can see already the building blocks of what is going to come together as an overall strategy throughout this fight. The idea is you come forward with something a little bit non-committal, but just threatening enough to provoke the parry riposte response from Henrik. And when he throws that parry riposte response, you are going to recover quicker, either parry riposte in your own right, or maybe just change under or change through to another attack and land that one instead. Now, I can see no better example of a probing strike setting up a really great follow-up than this exchange right here. Yannick comes in with a slicing undercut to the hands, which fulfills all the criteria of a probing strike. It's not very far committed, it seeks a shallow target, you still have to parry, and it is difficult to parry, but it's something that you could theoretically ignore if you were already attacking to begin with. But given that Henrik was always going for these parry ripostes, you knew that he was probably going to try to parry whatever it was that came at him, and upon realizing that it was an undercut to the hands, instead of parrying, he simply voided his hands backward and kept them closer to his body while moving backwards. A really intelligent response. However, the other thing about this undercut to the hands that was so special is that its recovery was extremely well timed. When Yannick threw his undercut to the hands, he ended in almost a high vom tog position, which put him in the perfect spot to then throw the follow-up technique, a descending cut to the head of Henrik. Now, Henrik, who had voided his hands backwards and a little bit towards his right side in order to not get hit in the hands, now had to cross his entire body line over to his upper left side in order to try to defend the follow-up that he didn't really know was coming. And this is the power of a probing strike. It puts your opponent in a completely logical but still compromised position from which they can't necessarily throw a good follow-up. And if you have somebody who's always fishing for those parry riposts, this is a great position to put them in because it feeds off of the fact that they can still make an intelligent defensive position or decision and still end up in the wrong spot. Now, in a follow-up exchange, we see Yannick go for another probing strike setup, but this one doesn't work out quite the same way. It follows some of the same principles as the one we saw previously. Yannick goes for a shot towards the leg and then follows it up with a thrust to the chest. Henrik, who has to slip his leg in order to defend himself from that leg shot, does manage to parry the follow-up thrust and get a riposte out of it. But why was he able to defend the follow-up strike this time where he wasn't before? The answer is in the defensive posture and, more importantly, in the position that a probing strike needs to put your opponent into if they are going to be vulnerable to a follow-up strike. In the previous exchange, that little underslice to the hand forced Henrik to move his guard into a completely different spot. But when Yannick went for the leg, Henrik simply slipped his leg and basically returned it back to the position it was already in, which meant that he hadn't actually created any kind of opening. There was no opportunity for Yannick to seize on, and so when he threw his follow-up strike, he found Henrik's defense to be just as strong as it was before he threw his probing attack, and he was easily parried off to the side and riposted. Now, this was an absolutely fantastic fight to watch, and if you think that it looks like Yannick was absolutely dominating, well, he was in the first round, but Henrik pulled an absolute 180 and started winning in the second round. So, a really exciting fight that you should watch, and I'm going to put the link down below to watch it whenever you feel like it. But that is, unfortunately, all I'm going to talk about as far as this fight goes. There was a lot to talk about, but maybe not a lot that fit a central kind of theme, and frankly, I've been dealing with some internet issues. So, it's going to be a little bit of a short one today, but I will see you next week with a new video.